This is Criteria. Alrighty, welcome back everyone to Criteria. I'm James Majewski here with my co-host Thomas Miras. Hey Thomas.
Hey James.
And today is a very exciting episode, long awaited. We're talking about 3 films today, 3 big ones. These are what are known as Terrence Malick's Weightless Trilogy of films, beginning with To the Wonder, a film from 2012, followed by Knight of Cups, 2015, and finally Song to Song, 2017. And before we go any further, I want to also introduce our guest co-host, Nathan Douglas. Nathan, thanks for being back with us to talk about these movies.
Great to be back, guys. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, it's been a while since our last episode, partly because of, Holy Week and Easter, and also just that we needed more time to prep for this one because we're discussing 3 films. And, I think with the exception of Malick's first 2 films, we've given each of his films its own episode, even his, lesser known documentary that we discussed. But we decided to discuss all of these 3 together because they people have described them as being a trilogy of sorts. And that's because they share a lot of similar formal approach, similar themes. They're all in a contemporary setting. I think that they are all. I think they're the first films in Malick's career that are fully set in the present day, right? Because the Tree of Life had contemporary sections, but it was mostly set in the 50s, or like the beginning of time.
Right.
But
same thing.
Yeah. So they're contemporary in their setting. They're dealing with very, very contemporary issues. They're among some of his darkest films, although there's obviously darkness in, I guess there's darkness in all of his films, but tonally maybe, I don't know. But they deal with this sort of like modern malaise. They all deal in particular with like the breakdown of sexuality, with romantic relationships, and they're, semi-autobiographical in certain ways, some of them. They all have at least some kind of religious aspects to them and deal with family, fecundity, reconciliation. And another reason we're discussing these in one podcast is they all bring up kind of similar moral concerns in their content, because Malick really for the first time in his career is going deep into the territory of, I guess you could say, just sexuality in general, psychology, spirituality, morality of it, and, pushing some boundaries and I guess, we can talk about his approach, but trying to thread this needle, of handling this stuff in a way that communicates what he's trying to communicate while still being tasteful and, succeeds in that often, but sometimes crosses moral lines. So we'll have a lot to say about that. And I suppose if people are interested in listening to that part in particular, we can, once we record this, we can put a timestamp for people to jump to that, in the show notes. But so because with all of these films, we'd be kind of repeating the same essential discussion about the morality issue, we figured it would be best to discuss them all together for that reason as well.
Yeah, and it's not just that. I think that the most salient thing that joins all of these films is their sort of formal aspect. Because
do you want to talk about what that very briefly?
Yeah,
what that
so
looks
Malick
like?
is leaning even more heavily into the sort of stylistic approach that we saw him pursue in Tree of Life. So by that I mean, there's a lot of fluid camera work, a heavy reliance on montage, a lot of use of voiceover, very poetic and sort of, impressionistic in its approach. And so it's easy to look at these 3 films as sort of all being of a piece, if for no other reason than just their formal elements. And so there's a lot for us to talk about. I think to guide our conversation, we'll sort of use 3 goalposts of, first, we will want to talk about some of those formal elements, and, we can keep returning to that throughout the discussion. And we'll also want to talk about their overlapping themes, where they diverge and where they converge.
Right.
And then finally, I think we'll want to have a robust discussion about the sort of moral quandaries that these films present, where Terrence Malick is more or less successful in sort of striking that right balance.
Yeah, and I will say on that point too that, just as a caveat, just because we're discussing these films on the podcast doesn't mean we're automatically recommending that you go out and see them. That will emerge, with the discussion, and you'll have to make your own decision. But that, that's another reason I wanted to discuss these all together, is because I think it just made sense to sort of consolidate all of those issues into one discussion.
So before we go much further, I'll just take a moment to introduce each of the films, give a brief synopsis of these three movies that we'll be talking about. But before that, Nathan, was there anything else you wanted to add by way of introduction?
Yeah, I just think the only thing that we haven't covered so far is kind of the concept of these films as a group, from like the viewer's perspective. And part of that has to do with they all kind of came out of this burst of activity, this burst of productivity after the Tree of Life, or as the Tree of Life was kind of being rolled out on the festival market. Malick goes back into production on To the Wonder, in 2011. And by the time the fall of 2012 is rolled around, he's already showing that, at film festivals. So it was kind of a stunning turnaround for a Malick film, after so many years of his reputation being that it takes a long time to put out a film. To the Wonder, is put together relatively quickly, at least, against that popular, conception of Malick's speed. And then Night of Cups and Song to Song, I believe, were shot very close together. They weren't shot together, but they were shot essentially almost back to back or within a very short amount of time. And with some of the same actors in some cases, whose different subplots did or did not make it into either film. And so, these films are seen as a group largely because they kind of come out of this explosion of activity on Malick and his team's part. And even though it would take years for them to actually see, to be released, Night of Cups, comes out 3 years after its production, and then Song to Song comes out, about 5 years after it was shot. So in that case, we have a return to the sort of the Malick editing timeline. But because they were all, the last thing I'll just say is because they were all shot in the sort of the same window, they definitely share this formal kinship with the camera style, the way that Emmanuel Lubezki and his camera operator are reacting to things. There's this definite unity in how these films are about responding to the moment in a way that you don't see in the Tree of Life, even though it's definitely like an extension of what they started in the Tree of Life.
Right. Oh, yeah. One more thing I'll say, too, is, whatever people's judgments about these films, because these films are very critically divisive as well. Probably the most in Malick's career, I'm sure even more than Tree of Life, in terms of how people reacted to their formal qualities, especially whatever judgment you might make of them artistically or morally. This is a very important period in the career of this important, religious, broadly speaking, filmmaker of our time. And also, you hear To the Wonder and Night of Cups mentioned a fair amount by Christian and Catholic film critics and intellectuals discussing Terrence Malick's movies. So we're addressing all of that here as part of our overarching project, looking at the whole career and trying to make sense out of this man's career path. The next film he makes after these is, of course, A Hidden Life, which puts him on the map even more for a lot of Catholic viewers. So it's kind of like, what is he doing coming up to that? Because everything he does here informs that film stylistically as well, even though in some ways it goes back to a more conventional narrative.
Okay, so with all that said, I'll sort of briefly orient our discussion by giving you a synopsis of each of these films. But first I'll say that these are loosely called the Weightless Trilogy, not by Malick himself, but sort of by the rest of us. It gets the name from the working title for Song to Song, which at one point was Weightless, but I think it also sort of conveys the kind of aesthetic and sort of thematic
floating feeling of
yeah. But so first with To the Wonder, this film follows an American played by Ben Affleck, who meets this beautiful French woman played by Olga Kurylenko in Paris. And after sort of a whirlwind romance together in France, they move to Oklahoma together with her young daughter. So the gradual unraveling of their romance is interwoven with moments from the daily routine of a priest, played by Javier Bardem, who is undergoing his own sort of dark night of the soul, and in fact eventually ends up counseling both characters separately at different points in the film. As we mentioned, this film is very fragmented and poetic. It makes heavy use of montage and voiceover, shots of nature, very much along the lines of what we saw in Tree of Life, but sort of exploring this theme of romantic love and a possible opening to an encounter with the divine. Knight of Cups is a bit of an odyssey through the hollow hedonistic world of LA and Hollywood. It follows a womanizing screenwriter played by Christian Bale and his many successive relationships, including with characters played by Cate Blanchett and Natalie Portman, sort of as he searches for meaning and wanders adrift in this world of excess and existential ennui. With this one, Malick veers a little more into the surreal and makes heavier use of literary allusions as well as a framing device whereby he splits the film into sort of discrete chapters with intertitles and names derived from various tarot cards, hence the title of the film, Knight of Cups. Finally, with Song to Song, we follow a love triangle revolving around the character of Faye, a musician played by Rooney Mara. And it involves her relationships with a manipulative music producer played by Michael Fassbender and an up-and-coming musician, fellow musician played by Ryan Gosling. They're all involved in the music scene in Austin, Texas, and the film is notable for featuring many cameos from several different real-life rock musicians, including notable roles from Lykke Lee and Patti Smith. And it features several scenes that at least appear to have been filmed at the South by Southwest Music Festival. One more thing I should mention is that Cate Blanchett and Natalie Portman both make appearances in Song to Song as well. So I think that's enough to sort of situate us.
And we'll be talking about these characters by the names of the actors,
right,
for the most part, because the characters' names are usually not mentioned that much, and it's hard to remember them, and it's just easier to say the actor.
Right.
Yeah.
Good.
The thing that these films, I guess, most have in common, not that there aren't any distinctions between them on the formal level, but that is like probably the most connective thread, even more than the themes, because they differ somewhat in themes and story, right? But they're all kind of coming out of, Nathan, you mentioned they're coming out of this approach, very montage heavy approach in the Tree of Life, but kind of taking that even further, taking it to an extreme. And especially in Knight of Cups and Song to Song, it's almost like the entire film is montage, So I think that maybe is part of the reason why some people struggle with these films, because they kind of leave so much for the audience to fill in, I guess, is part of the thing that he is doing with this, and They operate in the realm of memory to a large degree, like Tree of Life did.
Yeah.
And you're sort of getting things in the fragmented form of memories a lot of the time. In fact, in To the Wonder, the voiceover is explicitly delivered in the past tense. Mm-hmm. Nathan, these films I mentioned are very controversial critically for their aesthetic approach. So I don't know, maybe we could jump in that way and sort of talk about what it is that people find challenging about the films, and then sort of say what there might be said in response to that.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a great way to start. And I'm going to air a little bit of personal baggage by saying, for me, this question is impossible to separate from the sense of back in 2012 when To the Wonder premiered. I believe, I don't know if it premiered at the Toronto Film Festival, but it definitely played there. And we're only a year removed from the critical Rhapsody, that was The Tree of Life. That was a film. The Tree of Life was a film, when it was coming to first be presented at the Cannes Film Festival in 2011. There were immediate comparisons to 2001: A Space Odyssey. There was all this excitement, all this anticipation. This was the magnum opus of Terrence Malick, and the film lived up to that reputation. It won the Palme d'Or. It was nominated for Best Picture at the Oscars. It somewhat controversially, didn't win Best Picture at the Oscars, according to some. And then a year later, you would think that with all that excitement, all that steam built up, To the Wonder, hey, look, we have a follow-up. We have another Malick work. We are a very lucky population of critics, we might say. And I will never forget that feeling of reading those reviews as that film came out, and then once it went into general release in the spring of 2013, it was the same thing all over again. This sense of disappointment, it was like air coming out of the critical balloon. All of a sudden, people were tired of the Malick style, the Malickian, way of doing things. And so I think that's the best place to start, in that for some reason, many critics were annoyed that this film had, people twirling. It had long grass and wheat fields. It had, we don't have to go through all the Malick sort of visual tropes. But
we call it the Lyme disease trilogy.
Yeah, no kidding. Anyway, all of a sudden, it's a very curious thing. All of a sudden, there was this critical fatigue with the Malick's the formal attributes that are associated with Malick at the time. And all of a sudden it just couldn't really it was like people just were ready to move on. Now there were certain defenders and people tried to sort of champion To the Wonder, but this trend only continued. It only deepened with Night of Cups and Song to Song. There was this descent in terms of Malick's critical kind of reputation, because every time a new film came out, it felt like, people would give it 5 minutes and then roll their eyes and say, no, it's wandering around. This character is twirling. It's kind of like a dance, And so there was a sense of, this sense of fatigue, of exhaustion, that he's finally run out of things to say. He's run out of things to do. And I think it's not an empty criticism. Like, definitely is a valid observation there to be made there about he is kind of repeating certain formal stylistic tropes that clearly he enjoys, but the more interesting question is, like, why is that? What's going on? What's that all about? Instead, when these films were released, they were met largely with widespread dismissal and contempt, actually. And so I don't know if I seem a little prickly as we talk about this, it's partly because there's a good solid decade plus of trying to champion these films. I think we should just dig into what he really is doing with these, as you were saying, Thomas, the sort of montage, or this like almost stream of consciousness kind of style of just images coming at us. Even calling it montage, I'm not even sure is maybe even the right thing, because montage suggests there is a real kind of intellectual or ideological trend to be found, connecting the images, and the way that the images connect in these films, I think sometimes even escapes that, and is at an associative level that is like something else.
And especially in the latter two films, Night of Cups and Song to Song, I mean, there's even a great deal of variety of like location, for instance, within the montages, even comparatively to Song, which, takes place in Paris and Oklahoma. And
you mean To the Wonder?
Oops, sorry. Yeah. To the Wonder. And thank you. And in To the Wonder, you've got these three main characters, and some others. We didn't mention there's a second woman that sort of like forms this interlude into The Wonder, played by Rachel McAdams. And so you've got kind of those three main characters and some others and a couple of locations. But in Night of Cups and Song to Song, the montages are much even more fragmented, more quick cuts, more jumping around locations within LA, for instance, in Knight of Cups, and you're at one moment you're in a car going down the highway, and another moment you're in the apartment or you're at a party, and all sorts of things like that happening. And so I think especially in those latter two films, people can struggle to find like the coherent thread or the kind of the concreteness of what's happening in the story and what's happening with the characters. So I think that is that's part of the challenge of those two latter films in particular. I wouldn't say that Knight of Cups. See, I'm getting them all mixed up already. I wouldn't say that To the Wonder is very hard to understand on a plot and character level. You have a pretty good sense of what's going on generally. But yeah, so it's not exactly the same in each of the films, but I don't know. Should we talk more about the editing style, or go into the performances, or
can we start with camera?
Improvisation.
I think camera will lead us certainly into performance, and then maybe editing. We've already talked a bit about that, but I think if we start with how they're looking at the world, I think the most significant part of this departure, we might say, or extension is. It's very wide lensed, and we've seen this before in Malick. We've talked about this before. He has this kind of wide, expansive view of the world that he's filming. But here it even goes even further, and you see a progression from To the Wonder to Song to Song. Song to Song has, I think, the widest shots in terms of like focal length. I don't know what length lens they were shooting, but it's almost like it's not fisheye, but it's getting about as wide as you can get. And so that suggests there's this interest there's a progression in this trilogy towards a kind of almost like you're eliminating the bounds of the frame, this desire to kind of, I guess we could associate that with the desire to kind of capture life as close as possible. And then part of that as well is the camera work, by Emmanuel Lubezki and by his main camera operator, who's I think the name is escaping me, but he's
Jörg Vidmer.
Yeah, Jörg Vidmer,
who is the DP on later on A Hidden Life.
Yes,
right?
Yeah. They all developed this kind of language together where they were all in. Malick, Lubezki, and Vidmer have worked together at this point for so long that they just became this cohesive unit of what to shoot, how to shoot. And so you see the reactivity, that's responsiveness to nature, that responsiveness to things. People who were worked on the New World were complaining about, Malick would be pointing the camera at the osprey or something instead of at the actors. And like here, it's like that principle is just like, is the entirety of the films. Now it's, the camera's focused on the actors most of the time. But you really see that.
But if a train does go by, it will sort of like,
yeah. And the camera, and again, I think, I don't know if you guys be curious if you notice this as well, but like, I certainly noticed rewatching Song to Song last night, and I watched the other two last week. There definitely is like an intensifying of, I think, responsiveness of the camera, of the idea of like the camera is a participant, kind of, is this really responsive character to what's happening. And I think that, for me, that's the starting point of the camera is our way, we're trying to not just like form what we're seeing according to what the camera wants. We're really forming how we see this to what is unfolding in front of us. It's a very, kind of real, not just realism, but it's really trying to get at this reality. It's this response to reality, to a degree, even I think more than what we've seen in Malick previously.
Yeah, I mean, I think something that distinguishes these three films from Tree of Life even is their greater sense of improvisation and like aliveness, if we want to call it that. I think that with each film, Malick leans even more heavily into the sort of improvisational quality that he's asking from his actors and from his cameramen.
Particularly starting with probably The New World and then accelerating.
But it's clear with New World and with Tree of Life that, he's still working from a script, and I think that that's a little less so with To the Wonder, and then even less so with Knight of Cups, and then even less so with Song to Song. I think also you see the plot sort of being emphasized to a lesser and lesser degree with each successive film.
Yeah. Right.
So it's a little more coherent in To the Wonder, but then a little less so with Knight of Cups, and then even less so with Song to Song. And just to go back to this fatigue that you were remarking on, Nathan, I find it strange because if we look at other artistic mediums, we allow artists of all kinds to sort of remain in a period or with a certain subject, iterations on a theme, whether it's in music or visual art or, photography or what have you. But here, when Malick is doing the same thing, it all of a sudden becomes this
how dare
terribly boring. Yeah. And I think something that's worth bearing in mind here is that these films, they all strike me as unapologetically experimental in their thrust and their intent. Experimental is not just an aesthetic. It's not just like a thing that somebody goes for. It's actually an experiment. It's an attempt to work something out to see if it works. And, that requires commitment, even if the experiment doesn't quite pan out, right? So I personally think that each of these films is a little less successful as an experiment. To the Wonder, I've mentioned it on the podcast before, was the first Malick film that I saw, and it blew me away. I saw it even before Tree of Life, but certainly before any of his other films, and I'd never seen anything like this before, and it became an instant favorite of mine, and I knew that this was a filmmaker that I needed to pay attention to. And I still quite like Knight of Cups and Song to Song, but I personally feel that each one is a little less successful as an experiment, and that there's something about To the Wonder that feels a little bit like lightning in a bottle, like really just everything worked really well. But I don't begrudge Malick this. I don't then think, oh, well, he should have just, scrapped the project entirely. No, these are labors of love, and they require a commitment on the part of the artist to sort of see things through. And then the piece ends up being what it is.
Right.
And it has its good qualities. I think that there are strengths in Knight of Cups and Song to Song that I quite like, even over and above To the Wonder. But I'll never begrudge an experimental artist, their sort of missteps in the context of experimenting.
Right. Yeah, I wonder if the part of the reason is that, well, some people would be like, okay, you've had your experiment, now go back to doing something else, or in this case, maybe that they felt that he is doubling down on the same experiment with like you were just saying, with sort of diminishing returns. As I think even you said after we rewatched, we rewatched, having already seen the films, rewatched them in reverse order, preparing for this podcast. So the last one we rewatched was To the Wonder.
Yeah.
And I think you said after we rewatched that yesterday that you felt that maybe the other two were trying to sort of like repeat capture that lightning in the bottle again without quite working, and that the performances of the other actors were maybe a little derivative.
Well,
of
and
the
that's something that I wonder is that with Song to Song and Knight of Cups, you have the advantage or perhaps disadvantage of having tread some of this ground before. And that's not just for the filmmaker, but it's for the whole team that's involved, including perhaps especially the performers themselves. In the case of Knight of Cups and Song to Song, we even have some of the same actresses being reused,
Right.
And so there might be a certain extent to which this isn't necessarily all on the shoulders of Malick, maybe even, because I do think that the performances in To the Wonder are the strongest of the bunch as well. And I think that perhaps some of that comes from the strong sense of charting new territory, of doing something new, doing something different.
Right.
I think Ben Affleck, each of these films features a sort of inscrutable, alienated, wandering male, But Ben Affleck, I gotta hand it to him. He is just sort of a standout of the bunch. I don't know what it is. Maybe it's that he has this real like blue collar as aesthetic that sort of lends itself to this sort of male withdrawalness, and sort of like walls up around his vulnerability. But there's also just a clear depth and sensitivity in his presence, in his sort of admiration of Olga Kurilenko, the woman that he's in love with, or his sort of own like pain in the context of the various betrayals. I think that maybe he gets a bad rap, Ben Affleck, but he's a really good actor, and it really shows here. But then when you get to Ryan Gosling in Song to Song, there's maybe a lot of similar qualities between the two of them, and you just sort of wonder if maybe Ryan Gosling has the added sort of challenge of having to grapple with the fact that there are other performances that have preceded his, and maybe he's seen something of what those looked like.
And he's not doing something for the first time. He has a preconceived notion.
Yeah, right. So I don't know. I'm speculating there.
Yeah. Well, I noticed in reading, I didn't read a lot of reviews, but I noticed that some critics who really liked To the Wonder, you sort of dropped out for Night of Cups and Song to the Song. Or in one case, I think somebody who even liked Night of Cups a lot sort of dropped out for Song to Song. And I think one of the things that was bothering people, especially about the latter two movies, was a sense of a lack of clarity by comparison with To the Wonder. Clarity, one of the three criteria of beauty. So, it's no small thing if a film lacks clarity. Now, of course, there are different kinds of clarity, but a sense of vagueness, a sense of even, I would describe it in the latter two films as a sense of interchangeability of certain sequences and certain scenes, sometimes even certain characters between the two films, like, oh, this could have been in either.
Yeah. You got to be careful with that clarity language, right? Because, that's St. Thomas, and, that's understood in a different way by different people. So what we mean by clear is not necessarily, a legible narrative.
Yes, okay? That's right. Yeah.
So I think that the Latin that he uses there actually relates more to luminosity.
So Malick wins then.
Well, no. This is a little bit of a pet peeve of mine, because I don't think you can just sort of casually say clarity is a criteria for beauty and move on. Yes, in the opinion of St. Thomas Aquinas, the vaulted opinion, I bow to this opinion, but I think that it needs to be nuanced, because if you look at what he says, it relates to a kind of capacity of a work to illuminate or shine forth its sort of form.
You're right. I was fudging a little bit there.
Yeah, but so
I was trying to get one over. I'll admit it.
That's great though, because it totally opens up the deeper conversation, which is there's a clarity to the structures that Malick is kind of proposing in in a poetic way, and then there's, of course, there is the good of narrative clarity, which is like a specific kind of
yes, that's what I'm talking about, that people felt was lacking in the latter.
Narrative clarity is, it's important to say, an easy clarity.
Yes.
This is an easy clarity because it's one that we gravitate to, and it's one that we live in all the time.
That's
in the
right.
world of language and words and sentences.
Yeah.
But it's not one that Malick is prioritizing,
right?
And in fact, he's prioritizing it less and less with each film,
right?
And so this can be a point of frustration on the part of critics, but it's going to be a fault in their critical analysis if they're not sort of taking into account that this is not something that he's attempting.
That's right. Yeah. So then the issue might be more that sense of, for me, more that sense of interchangeability at times, where like even aesthetically, the last two don't feel so different. I mean, you've pointed out to me rightly that, okay, so maybe this particular character, maybe one of the women in Knight of Cups, for instance, isn't that fleshed out, but the story context is different in Knight of Cups versus Song to Song. And that's true. But I think for me, that's not always enough to specify it, because There's something about the performances themselves where, and maybe this is, something about what you're saying about being derivative of what has already been done, but also made simply because of the highly improvisatory nature of the films, where they can't rely as much on linear dialogue, and they kind of have to use this repertoire of gestures and dance-like motions and things that there seems to be like a common Malick repertoire of gesture that the actors are drawing on, and that may sometimes have its limits in terms of kind of intelligibility or being able to distinguish one character or one story from another. So it is an interesting topic of like, how do you kind of what are the limits of these different formal approaches? What are the, because everybody, not every filmmaker can be like Malick. I think we want all filmmakers to be more like Malick in some ways. I think we even said that in I think you said that about The New World. You were like, why can't everybody be like, why can't people make more films like this? But not in kind of like a stupid sense, but in like a kind of like drawing on that depth of vision that he has and that kind of sense of artistic freedom, right? It doesn't mean they're all going to mimic his style or be as abstracted or experimental as he is. And maybe there is a kind of like a privileged clarity to that narrative clarity that's just like part of how the world is made and how human beings are made. But that doesn't mean there shouldn't be a Terrence Malick doing his thing. Anyway, I think one of the interesting things too is like how the improvisation itself works. Like I saw a behind the scenes, like a 7-minute behind the scenes thing from Night of Cups, and it's just Christian Bale and Cate Blanchett wandering around on a beach, and it's really like almost seems like it's barely acting. They're literally just like walking down a beach, and she runs down the boardwalk and the camera runs after her, and like I get the impression that like that's a lot of what the shooting time on these films involved. Was like Malick had a lot of time that he spent just going to different locations and filming the characters walking around, sometimes not even like doing stuff with each other, but just like walking down a road or different things. And then it really is created in the edit. So that, the corollary of all that improvisation is how much of the film is created in the edit, which is also an interesting aspect.
Yeah. I think it's worth mentioning, like with my understanding with To the Wonder is that I believe there was a script of some sort. And I think you see that in the film. There's a sense of character, like the characterization of Ben Affleck and Olga Kurylenko and everybody, really. There's a very strong sense of like, we're rooted in, they knew what they were doing. They knew who they were when they were playing those characters. You don't see that to the same extent with Night of Cups or Song to Song. And I believe neither of them had an actual script. Or at the very least, if there were, it was basically like notes.
That's interesting.
So, and you see that in the performance, like the improv, like, anyone who's directed improvisation or just directed at all or acted, like you can see that immediately, that kind of like that hesitancy, that tentativeness in the performance, of people just kind of trying things, it's all over Night of Cups and Song to Song. And I think that's definitely something that critics were responding to of like that, it's a very slippery kind of, there's not much to grab onto there. It's clear the actors were kind of trying to grab onto something, and so the question is that a productive? I think, and I especially want to throw this at James as the actor, in this conversation. Like, does that come off productively? Like, does it produce something?
Yeah, I think that it's clear that there's more unevenness to the improvisation in Night of Cups and in Song to Song than in To the Wonder, and I would imagine that part of that would be accounted for by the more robust presence of a working script in To the Wonder. But I also don't want to discount the particular preparation of the actors involved, because it just really seems to me that Olga Kurylenko and Ben Affleck and even Rachel McAdams are just deeply, deeply invested in their character's interior life in every one of these moments. Mm-hmm. And that it makes me wonder about what it is that Terrence Malick is trying to capture in the frame, right? So we've talked about him being experimental, and what's he experimenting with? He's experimenting with cinema, with film, And this is one of the things that makes him so exciting about as a filmmaker, is that he's discovering new methods or sort of contours within filmmaking to achieve a particular result or capture something perhaps that is more or less elusive. And it's made me think about performance for the camera and performance on stage. You know, a lot of my work as a director and as an actor has been in theater. And I oftentimes have film taken of productions that I've done, basically for archival purposes, so that I can look back at them later as like kind of documents of work that has come before. But invariably, it never feels that the substance of the work has survived the translation. And so I very rarely feel comfortable actually sharing this footage with people, because, you know, you would only be sharing the footage with someone as a way of sharing the work. But if the work is not present in this footage, then what are you sharing, you know? And so it's not that I have a higher, opinion of my work in the theater than is real, you know? It's not like looking back at this in video shatters my illusions. No, the camera has failed to capture something that was present for the performance because it wasn't made to be captured by a camera. And so I wonder, you know, then if like the reverse is true somehow, that it's difficult to feel in the moment live what's actually going to succeed in the camera, in the frame. You know, that it only can really be discerned retrospectively, you know, or by looking back at the footage or whatever. And so I wonder, you know, it made me think about what are the kinds of gestures or the quality of presence that that's present in the theater but evades cinema, or that, you know, is present in cinema but evades the live event. And I personally think that this is something that Malick is interested in his performers, is in sort of cultivating a quality of presence that is going to translate energetically into the screen, into the camera, so that we feel it. And we might not necessarily feel, the narrative beats of what has just happened. We might not necessarily feel the subtext, although often we do, of what's going on in these characters' lives or interiors. But perhaps we feel something just on a pure visceral level in a way that's analogous to the visceral feeling of live theater, and that can't often be captured by a filmed version of that live event. And to me, To the Wonder really clarifies this, because there are moments in To the Wonder where a gaze, you know, just cuts you through the heart, you know? And that's a bit less so in Knight of Cups or in Song to Song, you know, and that what we get instead so often, say in Song to Song, is a little bit more of this reaching or this sense of like panic behind the eyes of the actor who is trying to figure out what on earth they're supposed to be doing.
Yeah, I think that's what Matt Zoller Seitz on RogerEbert.com said about, I think he said that about Song to Song, is like, it could be that Malick is saying that these are adults who act like children when they're sort of like dancing around and roughhousing and stuff, or it could be that like this is what actors do when they're like not sure what they're supposed to do.
Yes. Yeah.
But on the question of To the Wonder and the script and what exactly Malick was giving his actors, I read something from Olga Kurilenko, which was interesting. So she said that at first Malick just told her the story, and then once they started shooting, she would get 10 or 15 pages a day just describing the mood of her character. And then the other big thing was that he gave the actors like reading us like a syllabus of reading assignments. So for Affleck, he suggested Fitzgerald, Tolstoy, Dostoevsky, and Affleck also said he read Heidegger on his own just to like try to get, you know, into Terrence Malick's head somehow. And then Kurilenko, he gave her Anna Karenina, The Brothers Karamazov, and The Idiot. And he specifically she said that those books were like the equivalent of like the script for her, and that he specifically told her characters to focus on. So she said he told her to read The Idiot, focusing on two characters, one of whom is kind of romantic and innocent, and the other of whom is, she describes as insolent and daring. And she said that Malick told her, for some reason, you only see that combination of traits in Russian characters. And he was trying to give her that kind of vibe. So that's just like a little glimpse into the kind of exercise that he was having them do to kind of inculcate something in themselves so that it will come out in an improvisatory setting, I suppose.
Right.
Because you have to have something stored up to be able to outflow.
Right, exactly. And it's questionable to what extent the performers in the latter two films have that same degree of sort of like a stockpile stored up interiorly from which they can draw. I think it's like, it speaks tremendously to Ben Affleck's credit that he would just sort of take on the task of reading Heidegger, you know?
Right.
So yeah, but you know, like, this isn't to say that I don't appreciate the performances in Knight of Cups and Song to Song either, right? Because it is no small thing to get in front of a camera and do anything, much less, you know, just sort of play. So you know, credit where credit is due.
Yeah.
But yeah, certainly, you know, To the Wonder, I think, has the highest density of successful moments, you know, compelling moments with characters, where, you know, a word doesn't have to be spoken, but something is really deeply felt. Now, words are spoken in all of these films, sometimes as dialogue within the scene, but more often, perhaps, as voiceover. And even there, I think To the Wonder is more successful in the voiceover. Now, this might just simply be, you know, at the feet of the actors, right? Because, you know, ostensibly they're just reading words from a page into a microphone. But the voiceover in To the Wonder, whether it's Olga Kurylenko or Ben Affleck or, again,
Rachel McAdams' voiceover is like really intense. I really like
all
her
of them
voiceover.
really just like, and especially Ben Affleck comes to mind because he doesn't get a lot. He's very quiet throughout, and in fact, the most we hear him speak in that film is when he's on the job. He's like sort of. I'm not sure exactly what he does.
He's like an environmental inspector.
Yeah, you know, working for like an oil company. I think he's probably their inside guy doing the damage assessment.
There's a whole subplot that was cut from the film about him basically trying to track down these environmental hazards.
But I mean, it's still there in its sort of like kernel form, and it's still operating as a metaphor, you know, and also as a space where we see him, you know, like I said, speaking much more than we see him speaking anywhere else. There's like an irony there, but even in his voiceovers, man, there's just like this quiet, pained intensity, and longing. You know, they're almost spoken at a whisper. That's just so good.
Yeah, same with Rachel McAdams. Her voiceovers are very whisper, but like very intense.
Yeah. And Olga Kurylenko's are very good. They're often in French, or perhaps exclusively in French. So, you know, I wonder if that also is operating on me somehow because I can't actually understand what she's saying. I'm reliant on the subtitles, you know? Yeah,
I remember the first time I saw the film, I was annoyed by having to read subtitles in a Malick film because I was like, this is distracting me from the visuals. Now I can't just like allow it to wash over me, the voiceover. I have to like read it now. But on the second viewing, it was more just part of it was more natural.
Yeah, no, I don't think it's, but yeah, I mean, I think that by the time we get to Rooney Mara in Song to Song, I think that perhaps she's the least successful voiceover of any of them.
I like the voiceovers in Knight of Cups pretty well. But I agree with you.
There's something about hers that are just very flat, very very stoic, you know, and it's not that we don't have other stoic characters like Ben Affleck, for instance, but that, you know, it doesn't quite have the same charge. And you know, you'll have to forgive me if this sounds like a little bit of mumbo jumbo when you're using terms like charge or energy, you know, or presence, you know, but this is kind of what we're stuck, you know, resorting to in trying to describe this because it's a kind of elusive and spiritual quality.
I'm just glad you haven't used the prefix supra yet. Maritain does a lot in his last art.
These
book.
are spiritual films, and they're trying to make visible, make clear, luminous, something that's invisible, something that's often, totally overlooked, that we're insensate to, and it's I think in To the Wonder, especially because the thesis of that film seems so much to be this encounter with God, even in the midst of darkness and brokenness and highly imperfect, and fallen circumstances. Mm-hmm. The title, To the Wonder, I think for me is descriptive of this attitude of wonder in the face of even the most difficult human circumstances. Mm-hmm. And I think that you can take that hermeneutic and carry it through all three of these films, because they all, to some extent deal with this kind of searching and finding in the midst of great darkness.
Right.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Right.
James, that is a perfect bridge into thematic considerations. But unfortunately, I'm not going to cross that bridge yet. I just want to say, I want to ask you guys about the music.
Yeah, I was actually wanted to bring the music up. Oh man, Malick is just the best music film director. Man, he just is the best. And I would say that the music in To the Wonder, and perhaps in Knight of Cups operates pretty similarly to how it operates in The Tree of Life. There's a lot of long cues in To the Wonder, and I noticed a lot of repeated themes in Knight of Cups as he sort of goes on this journey. And then Song to Song is very different. I'm sure there's some orchestral stuff in there. I can't remember because that's the only one of these that I've only seen once. But Song to Song is different because it exists in this pop music and rock scene. And so there's some of that in Knight of Cups, but in Song to Song, that's what predominates, I think, is
it does, but there is a few motifs that there's one in particular that reoccurs, I think, 3 times in the film when Rooney Mara. It's usually when she's kind of coming to like a place of wherever she is in the. There's like 3 different points where she's in a place of reflection, and that's kind of I associate that with like the Rooney end of act contemplation music.
I see. Yeah. So in Song to Song, the music is much more contemporary pop rock. Some of it is quite noisy and electronic, and also the music in that is more fragmented, because usually when he's using classical music, it's not like the music cuts with the cuts, if that makes sense. But in this, he might do that because you're actually in a concert scene, and then it sort of cuts away.
Right.
So it's even the music itself is more fragmented. A lot of the music is more violent sounding. There's also scenes where somebody's playing the piano and singing nicely, or musicians are jamming out and things like that.
What is that, diegetic?
Yeah, right.
Oh,
yeah. A lot of the music is diegetic, and it's also funny.
Song to Song.
Yeah. So it's interesting. It works well. The soundtrack works well in Song to Song for what he's doing, but the soundtracks to the previous 2 are closer to my heart, and there's just some incredible cues in both of those films, and particularly in To the Wonder. There's one, the whole I'll talk about it more later, this sequence, but the whole, in much of the Rachel McAdams sequence, there's this piece that I was trying to track down. And it is, it's by a Finnish composer. I know Juhani Rautavaara, and his piece is called Cantus Arcticus, Concerto for Birds and Orchestra. You actually hear some bird songs at the beginning. And it's the movement 3, which is Swans Migrating. And it's this incredible piece where it's kind of like a somewhat normal, romantic, impressionistic sounding string piece, sort of this cycling melody. And but over it, you have these kind of dissonant woodwinds and I suppose some bird sounds mixed in there as well. And it's so beautiful and romantic and enchanting, but also incredibly unsettling. And it works perfectly because her character is falling in love with Ben Affleck, but she's going into this dangerous zone. So you feel the music is so good. It's like this this dangerous spell is being cast on her or something. It's just really powerful, and that is my favorite sequence of the movie, probably. And I'm sure that the music has a lot to do with that. So, I mean, it's just like he's knocking it out of the park musically in these films, as usual.
I think it's worth, sorry, James, I just want to, with To the Wonder, I think even compared to the later two, like To the Wonder is much closer to every other Malick film that has come before, where the music is operating as a participant and a kind of a commentary on everything else that's happening, where it's integrated for an emotional effect, or at least if that's not the intention, it definitely, Malick leaves in musical cues that are, absolutely like they register a response with the emotions. That was the most robotic way I could possibly put that. But in Knight of Cups, what I want to point out is To the Wonder is so focused on this romantic. It's very interested in this romantic odyssey, you could say, of like what is true love, what is love really for, and the music really kind of reflects that. Both in like a romantic kind of. In the romantic tradition of art, the music is very much reflective of that. For me, at least, the classic Terrence Malick musical move is the music as the ultimate climax, which, probably the example that comes to mind for everybody immediately in the Tree of Life is the Lacrimosa sequence, where the music overwhelms everything. And this Smetana sequence in Tree of Life, when the kids are running around with the football and everything. And we have a similar part like that. To the Wonder doesn't really have a knockout musical kind of moment like that until the climax of the film, when Javier Bardem's priest character is reciting the Lorica of St. Patrick, and he's praying it, and we see images of him visiting the poor and the sick, and the music underneath is Heinrich Gorecki's Symphony of Sorrowful Songs, or his third symphony, I believe. And there's a real, and that's played out like that, that's a slow moving piece that just builds and builds and builds, but there's enough, Malick uses that to really deliver the emotional kind of climax of the film. With Knight of Cups, you start to see all of a sudden that even though he's working with other kind of more modern musical pieces that also build slowly over time to a climax, he doesn't include the climactic parts. It's kind of all tentative. This is something that leaped out for me on the second time I watched the film, and I wrote up about it, back when I saw it. And it's you never really get that resolution, which is very much in keeping with the film as this kind of search, this kind of quest that, gets to a kind of resolution in a way, but really we're being denied that emotional resolution that comes with the music reaching a climax. And then with Song to Song, I think it goes even further. The music isn't even that emotional. Like, you get a lot more pop and rock, as you're saying, Thomas. But even the non-pop rock pieces that are used, are they're a lot more abstract, and so there's this kind of draining of emotional affect through music that is carried on from one film to the next. And I definitely think that's part of, why people respond more negatively to the later two films, because there's less of that kind of immediate emotional charge that comes just with the music. So I think it's worth, asking, like, what, is there anything there? Is that, what's kind of going on there?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's interesting too, because Song to Song, it's almost like Malick is deliberately subverting, your expectations vis-a-vis the music. I would never expect like Dionfort, the South African or like Afrikaans hip hop group to be, blasting in a Malick film while I'm watching a mosh pit,
Yeah.
But
it's like the beginning of the movie, right?
Yeah. That's the moment like we're in for a different ride.
Yeah. And he uses a lot of music from the performers within the film. We get moments of Patti Smith at the mic, or in particular, Like Lee, the Swedish musician that plays Ryan Gosling's ex-girlfriend, who sort of briefly comes into his life into the film. we get several of her songs in the movie as well. So it's like, it's interesting because the music is operating differently then, you know, it's doing something different. All of a sudden the words become a lot more important. This is music that has lyrics, you know, and sometimes it's not even lyrics. Sometimes it's just like a screamed, you know, thing to like amp up the crowd. You know, we are the future. The future is now.
Val Kilmer,
yeah, you know, stuff like that. So, yeah, it is interesting to look at the very deliberate pivot that Malick makes with respect to music in these films.
I mean, I think it echoes, just maybe the last thing I'll say on this is that there's, I was thinking earlier with regards to like the visuals, we were talking about kind of again, I don't think it's too much of a leap to say like the path from To the Wonder to Song is kind of akin to the path of like modern art in some ways from like the late 1800s to like the mid 20th century, where you're just getting you're getting more, not just more abstract, but more fragmented. Because when you put To the Wonder up to Song, like To the Wonder has so many striking images in it that just register on their own as sort of like concrete images. Song, I think is a, you know, I don't have any criticisms of like how it's shot, but there isn't like a single image, or there's much fewer images that register on their own. Like the images that really it is more of a mix of things, but that kind of makes me think of the later two films as like reaching more of like a cubist or something like thing where it's just, again, it's just more like shards.
Right. And it's like, I don't want to sound cheeky asking this, but you know, might it not be the case that Malick is sort of deliberately foregoing these kinds of, you know, demonstrations of mastery in his craft that are so apparent? If you look at virtually any other film in his filmography, perhaps maybe along the lines of say, someone like Picasso, who's very classically trained and capable of painting something, you know, very classically beautiful, but then turns away from that and does something much less obviously beautiful, you know, on the face of it, but is attempting to work something else out.
I think there's also a difference in the settings of the films, like the modern settings that he's doing different things with, like that he's not just dealing with the beauty of nature. You know, he can deal with some like very kind of like sterile looking modern environments and things like that.
Yeah, but you know, that's a visual motif that's present even in Tree of Life.
That's true.
You know, I think that is a motif that recurs, this sort of juxtaposition. But to me, that's one of the things that makes these films so American in their presentation. There's a lot about these films and about Terrence Malick's whole body of work that is especially American. Yeah. And if you look at the settings, not just the landscapes, but also the architecture and yes, particular spaces that we're in, be it a gas station.
Yeah, when I first watched To the Wonder and they're at like a modern gas station, I was like, my mind was blown.
Yes,
like,
but
this is a Malick movie.
we're out on the range, or we're down on Main Street, or we're in Hollywood, or we're at a concert, or you know, there's so much Americana on display, and he can render it very beautifully. Yeah. And sometimes he does, and sometimes he doesn't. You know, so it makes me wonder. You know, basically, I'll put it this way: when I watch, you know, Song to Song, and I don't see the same, you know, preponderance of beautiful images as I do in, say, To the Wonder, I don't think, oh, Malick is really losing his touch. You know, I think, okay, something different. He's about something different.
Yeah, perhaps. Know? And, you know, I'll be honest, like, Knight of Cups for me was a very visually... There's a lot of images that I retained just from my first viewing of that as well. It's a very visually striking film, even if more fragmented and memorable shots. Song to Song, I don't really remember anything except for that guy seems to have the same swimming pool in every house that he lives in, that same, like, Olympic length swimming pool. That's about the only image I really remember. But Knight of Cups has a lot of beautiful, the desert, the ocean, you know, crazy parties, the dogs, the greatest Malick shot of all time, the dogs leaping into the swimming pool. It's like all this slow-mo of dogs trying to catch balls and failing in the swimming pool. It's hilarious. Yeah. Anyway, yeah.
Good.
So,
Well, let's talk about the themes here. And we don't need to spend as long talking about this as we did with the formal stuff. I really do think that the formal stuff is the thing that most demands attention and discussion. And so I'm glad we've spent an hour talking about that alone.
yeah.
But these films are all thematically very connected. But perhaps maybe I'll just say a word on what I see as some of their differences or most obvious distinctions. So, we've spoken about To the Wonder and this sort of meditation on love and the discovery of God in the midst of fallen love, broken love, and perhaps, even desolation, experiences of desolation, such as are described by Javier Bardem's character. But in Knight of Cups, I think there's much more of a focus on hedonistic desire, sort of pursued to excess. There's a line that Christian Bale's character has, something to the effect of desire that I would give my life for, or something like that. I have it written down, but there's desire really comes front and center, I think, in Knight of Cups, even more so than it does in the others, even though it's present certainly in the others as well. And so we get this successive, seemingly endless loop of women in Christian Bale's life, where it's just sort of like rinse and repeat, rinse and repeat, rinse and repeat. And like you said, Thomas, there's a sense of interchangeability among all of them, and you're never really feeling super invested in any one of them, though, at least not the way you do in, say, the characters of To the Wonder. But again, one has to ask, like, perhaps this is part of the film's, this is where it lives and where it wants the audience to live.
Yeah.
And then with Song to Song, I think that this film is much more about the dynamic of someone who awakes one day to discover oneself evil, to discover that one is cruel, genuinely cruel and hypocritical and evil, and that you perhaps like it. So all of these characters are in all three of these films, they're all fallen, they're all living very broken, expressions of their sexuality, this gift of God. But I think that in the character of Faye, we get like a clear-headedness about it that is much more apparent, and explicitly expressed than in any of the other characters.
Right.
And so much of her meditation seems to be around this idea of like, what have I become? Who am I? And what is to become of me when this is what I long for? And I think that while all of these films sort of could be described as hopeful, every single one ends with a sort of turn toward redemption, toward goodness, toward a kind of conversion. Here, I think it's most explicitly expressed in her need for mercy. Quite literally, she says at the end of the film something along the lines of, I thought that mercy, I didn't realize that mercy was something I needed, or at least not as much as other people, but that somehow by the end of this film, she has come to recognize that she is in need of mercy to the extreme, to the utmost. And this isn't just pious talk, but the fruit of her experience of a real, coming up against this evil within her, this selfishness and like violence.
Another thing we didn't mention, common between Knight of Cups and Song to Song, is that they're both set in show business. I mean, we said that in our synopses, but in terms of common themes of like ambition and careerism, they're both of his films the most predominantly urban in their settings as well. L.A. and Austin. There's also a Vegas sequence in Knight of Cups. And so that, I mean, again, he's conveying the fragmentedness of urban lifestyle, of the chaotic life of show business ambition, and meeting a bajillion people and seeing what they can do for you and what you can do for them, and all of that stuff is very much a focus of those two films. I think it seems like in Knight of Cups, the slant on that is the quest and kind of like the emptiness of it all. And yes, there is stuff about interpersonal relationships and stuff, but then the focus on the show business aspect in Song to Song seems to be perhaps this element of the characters kind of using each other to get ahead. Yeah. Because like you said, we've got this manipulative producer played by Fassbender, and he is kind of taking both Rooney Mara and Ryan Reynolds as his proteges, but in these kind of weird parasitical relationships, mutually parasitical relationships with them. And so I think, obviously Malick is somebody who has a lot of experience in show business and has experience in, trying to keep show business at an arm's length to a certain extent as well, living in Texas. And it's notable that both of these films, if I'm not misremembering, end with a character leaving the city and moving back home. Is that correct? Does that happen in both of them?
Well, yeah. I mean, it's not as
definitely happens in Song to Song.
Yeah,
these two characters both. Ryan Gosling literally becomes like an oil worker, like a blue collar worker at the end of the film.
Yeah. Well, and again, it's sort of stated very explicitly in Song to Song.
Yes. That
for Rooney Mara and Ryan Gosling, there's a turn away from this like seeking after experience or novelty or living life to the fullest and going after actually the simple things that have been sort of privileged, from time immemorial, these are the things that they discounted. And sort of maybe perhaps foremost among these is the notion of children. And children is also a recurring theme in these films.
Children and faith. Yeah, there's gestures at that.
Children or the lack of children. Obviously, in To the Wonder, we have the actual perspective of a child in the person of Olga Kurylenko's young daughter, who initially moves to Oklahoma with them. We also have pain around her... what's it called? IUD, and her possibly needing a hysterectomy, and then questions of whether they're going to have children or not. In Knight of Cups, we also have allusions to, not having had children with a particular woman, or, at the end of the film, when Christian Bale has a relationship with Natalie Portman's character, an unexpected pregnancy that sort of exposes and destabilizes.
And an abortion,
Does she have an abortion?
Yes, she does.
Oh.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. So there's that. And then in Song to Song, we have moments, sort of lucid moments, when Faye is with her like nieces or nephews and sort of reflecting on the presence of children and children in a person's life. And, by the end of the film, one gets the sense that, yes, they're going to move out of the city.
Yeah.
He's going to have a normal job. And that she's probably going to be open to the possibility of having children.
Yeah. So just to correct myself, in Knight of Cups, it doesn't end with him moving home, but he does start a family. And there's sort of references to there's also reconciliation with his father
in Knight of Cups.
In Knight of Cups, I was saying he doesn't actually like move back to the country or something. I in my mind he did, but I'm just correcting myself.
Yeah, I don't remember anything about him starting a family.
There's a little kid. He's got a kid at the end of the film.
I think it can be read. Yeah,
there's a little kid wandering around. He's taking a nap in the house. His wife wakes him up.
It could be read that way. Like, that's definitely how I've read it on prior viewings. On this viewing, I wasn't as convinced that that's actually his family, but I definitely...
It might just be the child of the woman he's in a relationship
with.
I thought
some
sequences are not...
But
yeah, some of them are symbolic.
Yeah.
Knight of Cups is notable for this in it makes much more use of these sort of surreal, like dreamlike sequences where the thing that we're seeing is not actually happening.
Right.
So like one thing that stands out is we get this shot of the father walking across a stage, sort of like ranting and complaining about something, and there's people, there's this big spotlight on him,
Yeah.
and people are applauding. Okay, that's not real,
right?
you know?
Right, yeah. And in
but-
this scene I referenced, he is like taking a nap, so
it
it's
looks
possible that he's
very-
like dreaming
yeah.
about a child or something.
Yeah, and then and again, like too, like some of these sequences of him wandering in the desert. I don't know that these are actually.
yeah. So maybe there's even less resolution in that film than I thought.
And that's the
Well,
thing.
I
I think
really-
the only thing we can say about the Undeniably Cups is like he kind of like symbolically hits the open road. Like even the very last shot of like going, the car going down the road.
Okay.
Yeah, the last line
yeah.
is, "How do I begin?" Doesn't sound like a resolution to me, you know.
Doesn't he just say begin?
Oh, is it just begin?
It's even just
Okay.
begin.
How do I begin? It's a little different from
that
begin.
line is somewhere in
Yeah,
Knight of Cups.
yeah.
How do I
Anyway,
begin?
the
is
last
somewhere
line
in
is just
But
begin.
okay.
I will say, sorry, this isn't just a
So like
cul-de-sac.
opposite of resolve.
Thomas, like on
No.
all of my prior viewings except for this one, like I had taken the interpretation that he did start a family, and on this most recent viewing, it sort of struck me that that's not. I don't think we have enough info to say that that's the narrative
Yeah.
intention, but I can totally like I get where you're coming from. That's
Anyway,
been
the whole
my-
point is
yeah.
just that children figure prominently
Yes.
into each of these films, in sort of like being a challenge to the selfish, sterile relationships that are present. And when we talked about To the Wonder on one of our previous episodes, I think it was in our big Vatican film list discussion, Nathan, you said something about To the Wonder being sort of a remarkable look at contraception and the contraceptive mentality, unlike perhaps anything else that's been done in film. Did you want to add anything?
Yeah,
along
no,
those
just
lines?
like I won't repeat myself, I hope, but it just that I think it's just striking to see a film set in a doctor's office where they're pointing out like, here's the IUD, here's the womb, are you going to have kids? Like it's just kind of putting it, and then that question becomes the conflict driver for the next part of the plot. I think it's very clear in the film that Affleck's character does not want children. And that even in the way that in one of the love scenes that follows that that's that doctor's office scene, it's very clear like he's not actually willing to even consummate like the act properly with her because like, and the implication is that he doesn't want her to conceive. Like that's what I took away from it. So I don't know. I think the film is explicating like that's a thing that obviously a lot of is a major part of life today, and it's not something that you see kind of like just in a film, like in a contemporary film.
Yeah, I mean, I think we even get lines like even before that to the effect of like there's something missing, or sort of just like this vague sense that something that ought to be there.
The little
is
girl
not.
says that.
Yeah, right. And so I think that it very successfully dramatizes this sense of what happens when a part of yourself, even like a very central, perhaps the most central part of yourself, is withdrawn from another person, and what is the fallout from that? And we get that very clearly into The Wonder, but we also get it to a certain extent in each of these films, you know?
And I think you're right that Song to Song does end with the most clarity about like, okay, what are these characters doing now?
Yes. But
even
this
to The
is-
Wonder, it's not exactly clear.
I think this is also why, despite the fact that each of these films has morally problematic aspects to it, I'm willing to sort of, take it in a bit of stride or sort of like within a larger context, because it's so clear that Malick with each of these films is trying to explore territory that's virtually abandoned by Hollywood. Hollywood, what we get is a lie. We get unreality, and unreality is a strong theme in Knight of Cups. But it's true in each of these films. We have sections where characters are off on vacation and they're sort of in another world and they're high in the clouds, and then they have to come back to reality. Into The Wonder, we get a line like, "We have to face the facts." But where Hollywood so often, like 100% of the time, is feeding us this propaganda, this total lie about sex, about
we get like Poor Things or something. Malick
is he's venturing into territory that is just It's not touched by film, and he's not falsifying his subject. You know, he's going into he's working at the very limit, at the very like sort of extreme of where these characters find themselves. But these characters are not just exceptional in that regard. In a lot of ways, they're very ordinary. He's speaking to a historical moment in, you know, the West, for modern man, for film, you know, where all of these themes are very relevant, they're very present, but they're very not treated in their fullness, you know. And so I see him as fundamentally a kind of evangelist, like a kind of messenger who's going into these spaces and announcing something good that also comes with a lot of plenty of you know, warning and caution. And,
and he's someone who has a lot of life experience of, you know, brokenness. He's been in like 3 or 4 marriages, and I don't think has any of children of his own, which is why it's particularly intriguing why that like either regret about not having children or the desire to finally commit and have children is such a big sort of dynamic with these characters. Even in Knight of Cups, whatever it is that happens at the end there, I think it's in Knight of Cups, there's a scene he's walking through a restaurant and somebody at a table is looking at a sonogram video on their laptop, and he sort of like just stops and looks at it for a minute. So it's very clear, like the significance of this is very clear, I think, in Malick's films. Like the importance of having children and like the choice to be open and vulnerable in that way.
I would even think, you know, we were calling, you know, this trilogy, if you know, it's being called a trilogy, is called the Weightless Trilogy by some, but I think a more apt description could be like the Childless Trilogy, you know.
Wow.
I wouldn't, I mean, that's one way. I don't think we should.
No, but totally, man, totally.
You know, it makes sense. Like, and I think, I'm glad that we haven't touched on Malick's own biography before this point, because I think, you know, one thing we always want to be sensitive about with talking about his films, because he does, at least in certainly in the 2010s, he's drawing so much on his own life experience. You know, we don't want to overly color the film experience for people who are kind of coming to it for the first time, but it is a fact, you know, that he's drawing from a lot of his own story into the wonder of this relationship with this woman, with both these women. You know, it's drawn from his own life story, fictionalized. But you know, we know enough from his biography that it's a very personally, you know, it's a very personal story. And that Knight of Cups as well is a very personal, and some of the familiar autobiographical elements of like family conflict, the father figure, the struggling brother, are drawn.
A brother
from,
who dies.
Yeah, and then a brother who has died. That's all recognizable for anyone who's seen The Tree of Life. But I think, you know, the way I see these films more and more, you mentioned Malick as kind of an evangelist. I would prefer the word, calling him more of a prophet in a way. I know that's not too far off from what you're saying, but I see it more in the sense of like the kind of Old Testament prophetic lament. I think these are films of lament. And I think, if, again, not to color them too much with regards to his own personal life, which we don't know all about. But I think that you can definitely see the common theme between them is this lament for life not well lived, and this desire to redeem it. And I know that sounds kind of trite, you know, putting it that way, but it's there, and it's particularly there in the desire for children. It's particularly, you see that all throughout. Children are the ghosts kind of in these films. And I think that's probably their ultimate, that's the ultimate thing running through. Now, is that intentional? I you know, to some degree on the film, each film to film level, like, sure. But I imagine there's a lot there that's kind of just coming out of him being willing to put himself out there and to engage with just his own life, his own experiences, and in a, you know, very fictionalized setting. Let's be clear, these are fictional films. But I guess I've, you know, as a filmmaker, I'm very moved by how he integrates kind of what is from his story, you know, with a fictional story in trying to process like the reality at the heart of everything, you know, which is what is this life, you know, and what do we make of it? And to that end, like, I find that, the films, they have such a unity among them of this search, you know, this search for for redemption. And I think it's important to clarify that, except for song to song is as you guys were saying, is the one where we see there is a kind of resolution, there's a kind of redemption that is like more explicit. But what I think makes these films really effective and really, really powerful, especially for people coming from a non-Christian background, is to just see that they sort of see like the search just in and of itself, and it's not so much tied to a particular message. In my opinion, it's and I think that's probably the value of like sharing these films, if we want to use them to reach out to others. I think one of the great things they do is they're showing like the nuts and bolts of the search as like an existential kind of quest, which we then, of course, we can, we bring our own experiences to it. We read into more meaning into that. And I mean, so anyway, that, I don't know, maybe it's worth saying that, like, because I know we're going to get more into like the last part of the discussion and which touches more on kind of the idea of Malick as a Christian artist, as a Christian filmmaker. It's one of the themes in play there. But I don't know. I think it's worth clarifying like the nuts and bolts of what he's doing is maybe less of a religious quest, and though it obviously we would recognize it as that is kind of at the underlying it, but there is a quest. I don't know.
Yeah, I agree. I agree with what you're saying. Yeah, because I don't want to give the wrong impression by describing it as like evangelical, because it is more prophetic. It is more, lamentable. But there's a Christian thread in each of these films, and it's super obvious into The Wonder, where we have an actual priest. You know? It's also present in Knight of Cups from the very beginning when we get this opening quote from the Pilgrim's Progress, so that sort of establishes, the hermeneutic through which we should view the whole rest of the film here, but then we also get scriptural references in Song to Song, if I'm not mistaken.
I think so.
I'm actually,
there's certainly some like gospel type song lyrics in the film.
Right. And so that's why I also just sort of chose the word evangelist, because to convey this idea of him going into these dark places and finding some light there, and shining light on things that are otherwise ignored or completely falsified by our culture and by this film industry in particular. There's one sequence in Knight of Cups, man, that I think is amazing. It's when Christian Bale's character is present at this photo shoot with these female models, and it's sort of like this all-day photo shoot that goes from inside to outside by the pool, and you get the city lights, but it's interesting to me because it's so meta. We have the camera watching a camera capturing, the same thing that we're looking at. And so to me, it's this like profound moment of reflection on the actual activity of the camera. And it's sort of being brought into this project of creating unreality, because we have during this sequence, this sort of coach off the side, this female voice that's sort of speaking, really nasty things to these women, like really kind of abusing them and like calling them names.
She's directing them. Yeah.
She's directing them, but it's to bring out this quality in them that's completely divorced from anything real, or anything good, but here we are seeing this and seeing the activity of the camera through a camera. I don't want to belabor this, but to me, this is the clearest expression of Malick sort of commenting on this dynamic within the industry that he is a part of, so he must feel a responsibility to address it somehow, to speak to it. And so that's the sort of evangelist note that I would discern, in these films.
Absolutely. Right.
But, we've been talking for an hour and a half. Okay. And there's still like a big part of this discussion that we need to lean into. And that isn't to say that we can't, tie up loose threads here or there. Sure. But now that we're here, we have to sort of be frank that there are some moral quagmires here, and so you know, perhaps like uncontroversially, there are moments of, nudity and sexuality that just like are red lines, like that just, you don't want to see it. You want to turn away. You don't want those images. And like, I feel pretty good about drawing that line.
Right.
But then there are sort of unique, I think, considerations that are unique to these films and what they're doing. And that's less related to, a question of nudity or not,
right.
Of something being visually explicit or not,
right.
but more of its suggestiveness, its sensuality, its sort of erotic feeling,
right.
and the kind of like mood and headspace that it's bringing you into.
Yeah, and like how the actors are sort of behaving with each other in a kind of a general way.
Yeah, I mean, like, we could talk about the
effect on the viewer versus the actors.
Right.
And, yeah.
So I'm beginning with the effect on the the viewer. Good. Because I think, usually it's as simple as saying, oh yeah, hey, by the way, there's this one scene where, like you're going to want to look away. But here it's not quite that simple.
Right.
And I think that there are questions of prudence that enter in where like I couldn't easily recommend this to just about anybody. Or perhaps I couldn't recommend it to anyone without caveats,
Yeah, yeah. So, I mean, it sort of functions, I would say, in a similar way in most of the movies. In Knight of Cups, it's kind of, there's less like sex per se and more just sort of like general debauchery and like immodesty. I mean, there's scenes that I look away from even where there's no nudity, but because it's in kind of like maybe there is some nudity, but it's kind of like a strip club. There's just women, gyrating in bikinis or whatever, and I don't want to see that. And it's like a lengthy scene. There's a couple of extended scenes like that in To the Wonder, but it's less, sex scenes. And then in both Song to Song and, Knight of Cups, I meant to say, Knight of Cups. But then in To the Wonder and Song to Song, which are even more focused on particular relationships, there's kind of a mix of like scenes that are like pretty much outright sex scenes, and those are usually very, very fleeting for the most part, right? In terms of any actual nudity.
Yeah.
But there is some of that. And then, but then there's also this more general kind of like anything ranging from just like, innocuous displays of affection to like, caressing and kissing to like virtual foreplay, like, the character's fully clothed, but he's sort of like running his hand up the woman's thigh in like a particularly intense way or something that happens in Song to Song.
Yeah.
And so there, I'm just giving an example of like why there's this range of things, some of which are sort of like clearly crossing a line, and other things where like I wouldn't want to do that as an actor, but it doesn't necessarily bother me as a viewer. And then other things where I'm like, I'm kind of uncomfortable with this, but I'm not quite sure where it lands, Right. So that's why it's a little bit more of a complicated discussion than saying like, there's a bunch of sex scenes and you have to either not watch the movie or look away from them or skip them. Another of the issues too is like the way this all fits into Malick's style, which is very impressionistic and rhapsodic and kind of like, so it can get the feelings into you that way as well, without having something explicit. And there can be dangers in that, especially depending on what kind of mood you're in. Like I didn't commit a sin while I was watching To the Wonder for the first time, but I was very uncomfortable with certain things in a way that for some reason on my second viewing, they didn't hit me as hard. There were still specific scenes I objected to, but the overall effect of the film the second time was not as like disturbing, I guess. And I think that may be a product of either the fact that like I was just caught off guard by some of these things, seeing them in a Malick movie for the first time, or that I was in a certain mood or in a certain vulnerable emotional state. So that's why people kind of have to like know themselves too, as we always say.
Yeah, and that caught off guard thing is important to mention too, is because these films rely so heavily on montage.
Yes.
Like a lot of times you don't see it coming, so something will sort of flash across the screen or hit you, and all of a sudden you're maybe, faced with an image that you don't want in your head. And I think that all of that needs to be taken into account for anybody who's going to go into watching these films.
Yeah, because most movies you can see it coming and you'd be like, okay, I wasn't hurt by this at all.
Right.
Like when we watched Wes Anderson's, what was his last movie that we discussed together?
The Asteroid City.
Asteroid City. I knew that there was nudity in that film in one part, and it was very clear when it was coming, and I never saw it. I just like knew exactly when, even though it was my first time seeing the movie, because I could just tell. But it's different, like you say, with Malick's style.
Yeah, and I think also we keep saying like it's complicated. You know, there may be some people listening who are like, "Oh, it's not complicated." Like, you know, you just look away and all that. And you know, for like I think we generally agree with that sentiment.
Oh, yeah.
But the thing I want to highlight is, this isn't simply the case of your typical filmmaker or film where you can't be you don't have a strong sense of the way the filmmaker is approaching even the subject of human sexuality is through a dignified lens. I'm not going to make the argument that, like, I think we can have a conversation about like, does he get there or not? But I think what's unquestionable is that Malick is approaching this whole topic from a place of respect, a place of sacred, you know, recognizing that it is a sacred thing. But the unfortunate thing is that, you know, his that posture does not necessarily translate all the way to the ethics of how he films it, you know?
Right.
But that's partly why it's complicated, because the intention, I think, of these films is very clearly to reorient a viewer to a traditional respect for the dignity of human sexuality. But I think part of his method of doing that is to put reality in your face of, you know, it's you know, it's kind of a necessary evil in some ways. I can't speak for him, but that's the sense I get, is like there's a necessary evil of depicting these things kind of in their frankness in order to get to the moral point of view that he's actually coming from. And I think definitely that's an area where, you know, how our faith forms us can offer kind of a rebuttal in some ways to or at least nuance that.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, because even there is evident a certain reserve and reverence.
The camera's not leering.
Yeah. There's like a kind of chastity and you know, seriousness and reserve with which he handles even the sort of frank, ugly things, you know? And so it's what we would say, we would describe it as tastefully handled in any other context, you know, because
if it were violence or something like that.
Right. Because in any other context, we are so conditioned to just seeing such egregious violations of human dignity that here it's like very clear that he's working with tremendous reverence for human dignity and for sexuality, for the body. And yet, you know, I don't think that it would be controversial to say that, you know, some of our forebears in the church would have grave issue with these films, you know, or with aspects of these films. So, you know, I don't pretend to know the answer to these. I know that for me personally, I value each of these films, and you know, I sort of like, you know, I'm not giving like my blanket seal of approval to everything that happens within them, but I'm willing to kind of take it as a whole that here is an exceptional work from a filmmaker who, you know, is doing much more good. He's hitting much more, you know, good notes than he's hitting wrong ones. And if he is hitting wrong ones, I can sort of forgive it because I can see, you know, just how daring he is being in toto, you know?
Yeah. And the other thing I wanted to bring up from the viewer's perspective is like, you know, an aesthetic issue, which is we were talking about this montage aspect, but also the aspect of the way that you watch a Malick film is to kind of like go with the flow and surrender yourself to the images. And so it's kind of an artistic liability when I have to be on my guard in a certain way, whether that be with like a scene that like I can look at, but I have to look at in a guarded way, or a scene that I just straight up have to look away from. Right. Or if I can't remember where it is and I'm just sort of on my guard because I'm waiting for it to come up, you know? Right. And so that is detracts from the kind of experience that I want to have in surrendering myself to a Malick film, which can be a bit frustrating as well. Yeah, and then the other thing, I mean, I mentioned like the situation for the actors too. So there's the other end of like what kind of reverence is, you know, human dignity being treated with. Right,
and I think that's the most compelling argument here, because if it can be said that in the final product, in the film and in the camera,
In the cut,
everything is being treated very reverently and tastefully. Well, how did we get this footage? We had to improvise. Probably we had to improvise for extended periods of time. Engaging in behavior that in any other context would just be
caressing intimate parts of the body and things like
just
that.
unambiguously sinful. But here, because it's recontextualized within like this artistic project, does that now all of a sudden remove it from its moral context? I think the answer is obviously no. And so this is a big problem. It's like, then to what degree are we sort of like indirectly participating in that? These are open questions for me.
Those are the scenes. Those sorts of things are the scenes where it's like, I don't feel I'm obligated to look away, but I'm very uncomfortable with it nonetheless,
right.
In certain parts. And so that's where the kind of the ambiguous ground is. I don't feel it. I don't feel it's ambiguous for the actors. I don't think that a Catholic director should be having actors do those things.
Right.
But
it made me think of My Night at Maud's, why am I drawing a blank on his name? The director.
Oh, Romer.
Yeah. Wasn't there an anecdote about Romer?
That was a different film. That was a
Tale
different
of
film.
Winter.
Yeah.
Tale of Winter.
Where
a brief
he's going to shoot some nudity, and he had to leave the room so that they could do it.
Yeah, he left the room while they were filming it.
Right, a sex scene. Yeah.
So it's like,
right. So I do agree with you when you say Malick is treating these things with reverence, in the sense of what his intent is to show something that's true. In the literal sense, is it reverent to show nudity or even a brief sex scene? No, obviously not. But like, I get what you're saying as far as it's just so obvious that like sexual immorality is ugly, and that doesn't justify it. Like we talked in our Padre Pio depiction about that, right? Like that doesn't justify showing certain things, but like it does. In this particular case, in this particular context, like, obviously we're not supposed to judge anybody's soul, but like it, I understand what he's trying to do artistically. I have issues with it morally, and even on a worldview level, I appreciate it. And it is worth, when you're just judging, you're evaluating Malick as an artist and as a Christian artist, it is still worth stepping back like you've been doing and looking at this in the context of Hollywood movies, right? So sure, maybe it's easier for me to know when it's coming in a James Bond movie and look away. Nonetheless, the intention in a James Bond movie when Bond jumps into bed with somebody is very, very different. That is just glamorizing,
right.
Being able to sleep with whoever you want, right? And this is, we're not just end justifies the means people here. Like we're pretty exacting about that kind of thing. But at the end of the day, it's like, I don't think that we can say that Malick is I don't think that he is even guilty of romanticizing immorality except to the extent that he is showing the reality of what these characters are feeling.
Yeah.
And kind of the spell that they're under.
Yes. And I think it's what makes these films sort of eminently relatable to those for whom these films are relatable. And I think that if you look at, comments about the film, it'll either be totally disparaging, or it'll be there's a recognition of oneself and one's history. And so I think that, I can acknowledge that there's an artistic potency in what Malick does, and can still question the ethics behind some of these moves. And a proposal that I would like to make, is that for a Christian artist, these boundaries, these limits, they are limits, that they are restrictive to a certain extent. It is going to put a limit on the kinds of things that you can do, the kinds of powerful things, perhaps, that you can
especially
do.
in a given medium, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
And yet, I would also like to propose that these limits are not antagonistic to a fruitful creativity.
Yeah.
That I think what we get also simultaneously an example of in Malick is a kind of working with limit, tasteful reserve, and finding how to nevertheless compellingly articulate the darkness, the despair, the damage, or the beauty, the joy, the exhilaration. And I think that that's possible without committing sins in the process, either for yourself or for the actors that you're directing,
right?
Or perhaps, maybe, for many viewers, although again, it's always going to be a prudential question of like sort of what you're able to take, even on just an emotional level. We talk about questions of emotional chastity, and I think that that's not irrelevant either when it comes to a film like this.
James, I want to just bounce off that. I agree entirely, and I want to take it even a little bit further in the cinema context towards anyone, cinephile, filmmaker, whoever, so anyone listening who is interested in, if they love Terrence Malick's films and they say, why can't we by we, I mean like a more explicitly Catholic culture, why can't we have that? Because I think there's a tendency to watch a film that, like To the Wonder, I was saying, we were talking earlier about like the way it exposes the contraceptive mentality, without being preachy. And we think like, why can't we have that? Does that mean does that come as a package? Do we have to have the kind of like, the impurities that come with that, with To the Wonder specifically, in order, and it's easy to follow that mindset of, an authentic like Christian film culture that is really reaching the real, is really touching the most real things and really telling the truth, is going to have to be kind of ugly, in the ways that these films, are ugly. And I think we have to push back against that and say like, no, like we can take the lessons that they have to offer as far as like film form and offering an expanded view of how to make a film, and that the future task for us is to integrate that into a more holistic, Christian ethic of how to make films. Like, and it's very easy, I say this from experience, to fall into a kind of cinephile's despair over this question, because you think the only great films out there are the ones that are really kind of like getting to these extreme edges, or they're walking these thin lines, they're crossing lines in some cases. And it's like, no, we're in a transitional period of history, of film history, especially in the US, where the destruction of the production code that we've sort of touched on in previous episodes, we're still kind of in the like aftermath of that, and the sort of the moral questions of like how to make a really artistically authentic film that is dealing with like raw realities. We're still working that out, and I want to be very clear. I think Christian artists, and especially like Catholic artists, have a tremendous role in have absolutely crucial role in defining that, like, for the public, in the decades to come. So I think I'd say this: if you're worried about, we can't have nice things, we just got to accept the bad with the good. It's like, okay, well, in this case, dealing with these films, we have to, tread carefully, but also don't take that to mean that it's always going to be like this. Like, we can have a film with the caliber of like a To the Wonder or of Malick's work in the future that doesn't necessarily make the same compromises, but it's going to require all of our, creativity and intelligence, and receptivity and sensitivity to do that, to get to that. So,
and that's part of why we are discussing these films on this podcast,
right?
Absolutely.
Like, and because we're trying to encourage that, like, let's go to the artistic limit, and let's also like have a really high Catholic standard for things, you know. It does bum me out that, like, in the films in the period of his career where he's like most explicitly like referencing Christianity are like some of the hardest films to recommend to like our Catholic viewers. That is like I would love to be able to just say, hey, go watch To the Wonder to anybody, On the other hand, he comes out of this and does A Hidden Life, and he's got his film about Christ coming out, and so we can see another side. This is not actually the current phase of his career, So there's so that's interesting too. The other advice I would give is don't forget what we talked about in an earlier episode, which is make sure to be independently wealthy in order to create this. I was reminded of this in To the Wonder with the oil pumping. I was like, yes, that's the most autobiographical part of this film of all. It's like, this is where Malick's money is coming from. Anyway. By the way, just a little Easter egg, a Catholic Easter egg about these films is that We might have even mentioned this in an earlier episode where Malick was originally at one point planning to thinking about making an adaptation of Walker Percy's novel, The Moviegoer. Well, in Knight of Cups, he had Christian Bale read Walker Percy's The Moviegoer to prepare to his role. So that may be the closest thing we'll get to a great Walker Percy adaptation on film.
Here's another fun factoid is that the sequences with Javier Bardem sort of in the prisons or going through these sort of lower class neighborhoods were shot by a separate team. There was another director on those, and the conceit in all of those was these were real people that Javier Bardem was interacting with, and they fully knew that he was an actor, in costume, and yet there was something about that Roman collar and his presence and his simple listening that these people just opened up, just great vulnerability and manifestation of all sorts of difficulties and past travails.
Yeah.
And so from that footage,
and they knew he was an actor, right?
Yes, they did. Yep. From that footage, a separate sort of, you could call it a sister film, except that it's questionable whether this happened with Terrence Malick's blessing or not. But another short film called Kingdom Come, or Thy Kingdom Come, was made just completely with this footage. Now, I haven't seen that. And
you haven't?
No, I haven't.
Oh,
Have
really?
You?
No.
Yeah,
I thought you had.
I know.
Okay.
It's just sort of, it's just been one of those things I've had difficulty tracking it down. But anyway, I would love to see it because
Javier Bardem is great.
He's great. He's great, and those sequences are great. We get something like this in each of the films where there's a move toward sort of
marginalized,
and these non-actors,
homeless people,
real poverty and suffering. It's funny because in Song to Song, what that looks like to me is like all these old rock legends.
Interesting.
That's actually true.
Because there it's real. It's the Red Hot Chili Peppers, or it's Johnny Rotten, or Iggy Pop. And you see the wrinkles and the faded tattoos and the hoarse voice. But in Into the Wonder, it's probably the most effective. It's
part of the story. Into the Wonder,
and it's really it is in Song to Song too. But it's really moving, and it reminds one of this kind of pervasive unreality in Hollywood, where even if Hollywood has a film about poor people or drug addicts, so often they just look nothing like, because there's just something that can't be faked. You can't just take a Hollywood extra and throw on some makeup and get that quality of sun-damaged skin or, missing teeth or,
Unless it's Skinny Pete.
Unless it's Skinny Pete. And Skinny Pete does.
What's that actor's name? Charles Baker?
I don't know what his name is, but
from Breaking Bad, he's in the
he's Into the Wonder, and he's perfectly cast because he's got that quality, that sort of run down blue collar look to him.
Yeah.
I don't mean to use blue collar as a pejorative, but in Skinny Pete's case, it is a little bit. It's like edgy blue collar, and Ben Affleck is like
affluent blue collar. Yeah. Right. Interesting. Well, I don't know what else, but do we have favorite one to name our favorite sequences? Maybe
sure.
from across the trilogy, for the whole trilogy.
Okay, yeah, I'd like that. That's fun.
Yeah. I gotta think about that.
Nathan, why don't you start?
Oh man. Okay. Well, you know what? I'm gonna say I'll do two things. I'll say particular. One thing I love about these movies are the one-off moments. There's random piercings of just reality that in their very, very quick moments. But for example, To the Wonder, and they usually involve humor. So To the Wonder, there's a shot of a girl on a pogo stick. And I'm laughing thinking about it because it just comes out of nowhere, and in the middle of, this very intense film about the meaning of love. And we just see this girl on a pogo stick, and I don't know. I think I take them as, I believe that they're meant to be humorous. In Song to Song, there's a similar moment where these two two people go by on segways, the back when that was a novelty. The two again.
There's also like a overheard conversation about Call of Duty in
Night of Cups. My life
Night
is
of Cups is very funny. It has that going for it.
Nick Offerman's I believe it's Nick Offerman saying it, playing an agent, and the full quote is, "My life is like playing Call of Duty on easy mode." I just go around like
I didn't even know that was Nick Offerman.
Yeah, I think it's Nick Offerman. Anyway, stuff like that. I don't know. It's those are the things that I remember. Like, but in terms of like absolute favorite sequences, like I love the. I mean, it's an easy choice, but the climax of To the Wonder, the Koreki, the symphony,
the priest,
Javier Bardem reflecting on the love of God, gets me every time. I'll just leave it there. I could think of others from other films, but yeah.
How come all priests in movies that takes priests seriously, the priest is always going through a dark night of the soul? Are there any movies that, like, I guess the priest in Leon Morin isn't going through a dark night of the soul?
Well, there's the Bing Crosby, like the Bing Crosby. It's the opposite of the Bing Crosby.
Yeah, that's true. I haven't seen those. Yeah.
Character.
What about you, Thomas?
Okay, so I'll be honest that like these films don't really hit me emotionally the same way that Terrence Malick's earlier films, and especially The Tree of Life, do. For whatever reason, I realize that a lot of that is subjective. I think to a large extent it's because of maybe what I feel as like a lack of concreteness or something in Night of Cups and Song to Song. But the sequence that hits me the hardest emotionally is the whole middle section of To the Wonder with Rachel McAdams.
Sure.
I just really connect with her character above all the characters in the film. And she's kind of this, first of all, she's like so beautiful. She's like the most, I know she's a Canadian actress, but she's like the all-American girl in this, like farm girl in this film. But she's like,
we have farms up here too.
Yeah, that's true. She's lost a child. She kind of has a sadness to her. She is a Christian. She's quoting the Bible. She's asking Ben Affleck to pray with her, and she like really falls in love with him. There's this betrayal where he just uses her, basically. He uses her for lust and doesn't commit, because a lot of the movie is about his lack of willingness to commit. But so I really relate to that character. But there's this whole montage of when they're getting to know each other and she's sort of falling in love with him. And I mentioned The Cue already by that Finnish composer, and I talked about the music, but just the the beauty and the like treacherousness of the feeling that's engendered, and the kind of the wonder and the kind of all of those things happen at once. I mean, when I first heard that music, I was convinced that Malick had like gone to the next level in his scoring and literally taken two different pieces of classical music and like mashed them up, because the two layers of it sound so different. But it's just such an amazing, like, intense sequence, and her performance is really intense. Her need and what she's looking for is like so intense that like you like feel her desire, what she's looking for, but you also feel like fear for her. And
the shots of her wandering through this darkness, and there's like a flashlight
in the house
that's sort of moving over, the faces of a doll or, stuffed animals or something. It's like there's something very surreal and super unsettling as she approaches this dark stairway, and it's like the end of that relationship. It's sort of the last word, but it's conveyed visually in this very dark and tragic way. I love that sequence. Dude, I mean, To the Wonder, it's so hard to pick just one thing. There's so much, like, To the Wonder is my favorite of these films. It's perhaps my favorite film, full stop.
Oh.
But it's definitely among my top three,
Is it definitely your favorite Malick film?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Wow.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Yeah, like I said, it was my first Malick, and it's still my first love, But I'll just say that those first 7 or 8 minutes of To the Wonder, I think, are incomparable, especially all the sequences at Mont Saint-Michel, just so beautiful and such an arresting, visual metaphor.
Yeah, we didn't even mention that. That's
yes,
a big
but this like meeting between heaven and earth, But I think even, there's something about it being overcast and kind of rainy, that it just wouldn't be the same if it had been a sunny, beautiful day. It had to be melancholic. It had to be sort of sad, and there had to be something hanging over them, even in the midst of this like tremendous. I mean, it's exhilarating. It's beautiful, and it begins too with these grainy shots of them, on like a handheld camera, in the train, riding out. To me, it's more than just a sort of cute visual flair. It's entirely suggestive of this this idea of being outside of your normal world, being away on vacation, on trip, in these moments of plenitude that are totally separate, also totally evocative of reminiscence and nostalgia and memory, and it perfectly sets the tone for everything. So those, and the camera is moving so beautifully. All the shots in Paris, you talk about the reactivity of the camera and finding these great little compositions. It's those first 7 or 8 minutes of To the Wonder. If you watch nothing else, that's totally worth it. But I want to just say a quick runner up to all of the nightlife scenes in Knight of Cups. These are total pictures of hell on earth for me, just really frightening, really disturbing, but also somehow exhilarating and exciting and alluring. And one shot in particular, when they're in Vegas, there's an awesome shot of one of these women that he's with taking a zip line over the casino, and there's something, so exhilarating and
then right after that is the scene that we look away from.
Yes, right. Yeah. But and its juxtaposition is effective. But also something that captures the sheer excess. She's laughing and ziplining over crowds of people who are gambling and drinking and
wow,
and,
that's
it's
wild.
It is wild. It is amazing, and I'm sure that I could pick a lot of things from song to song as well. But I think that we can't discuss this Weightless Trilogy without mention of this weightless sequence in Song to Song.
Oh, yeah.
When they're returning from this vacation that the three of them take together to Mexico. And really we're seeing things from the perspective of Michael Fassbender's character at this moment, because we're getting his voiceover and he's saying something about there's a beauty in them, a beauty that I see in them that makes me ugly. And so there's this kind of Cain and Abel moment where he is convicted because of the goodness that he sees in their relationship. It's shortly after that he sort of acquires this wife, in Natalie Portman's character. But first we get this sequence of them in their private jet that's, doing this maneuver to sort of simulate weightlessness for them. And he's floating, and there's just in his gaze this wonder and questioning and disorientation that is perfectly aligned with what his character is going through in this moment. And so I think that
I like his performance.
Yeah, he is a great performance, but yeah, that weightless sequence is in a way emblematic for me of the whole shebang, the whole series.
And if you watch only one thing in Knight of Cups, it has to be the dogs in the swimming pool. It's just made me laugh so hard when I first saw it. It's great.
Yeah. I just wanted to add, while you guys were talking, I was thinking with Knight of Cups, my favorite moment is actually it's at the end of the Vegas section where there's these 3 quick shots of I don't even know how to describe it, but kind of if you go to an electronic dance music EDM concert, they usually have the big backdrop behind the DJ with all the visual stuff, patterns and light shows and stuff, and there's these 3 quick shots of concerts basically with people in silhouette, and I don't know what exactly, it would take me way too long to go into it, so I won't, but there's something there's a fundamentally religious feeling I have seeing that, when you see like just that primal need to like face the light and worship. And you see that, I mean, I'm fascinated with like EDM sort of culture in the way that it tries to reach that in its own way. But for a brief moment, Malick kind of like brings that in. And I don't know, I just love that there's definitely like an association there with that quest for light and beauty. And then in Song to Song, my favorite moment is, it's a sad one. Spoiler, a character, okay, I'll just say it. Natalie Portman's character, you know, she dies late in the film, and we spend a moment with her mother, played by Holly Hunter, who is found out the news while she's in like a Walmart parking lot. And and the camera just actually, I think it's one of those beautiful shots in the film. Anyway, the camera is just following her as she kind of wanders around this parking lot, trying to make sense of what she just found out. And it's just, to me, it's like that image of like, only in America, like, you know, and I say that like, you know, not in a mocking way or in an ironic way, but there's definitely like a layer of irony there where it's like, this is the surroundings where we find out the worst news, you know, and then look at how banal this is modernity, you know. But you know, I don't think Malick is not merely like pointing a finger. Like he's with the character. He's with this woman who's in absolute grief. Like the compassion is there, and I don't know. To me, it's just that it's all the layers are in there. That's like a very dense image.
Yeah, there's another scene where Rooney Mara has a emotional conversation with her father, and they're like at a gas station, and it's like, that's where those things happen sometimes.
And I want to say that this is something that I appreciate about Malick is his depiction of these sort of like banal or pedestrian environments, especially suburban environments, you know, that kind of are in many ways devoid of character, or the kind of character in life that accrues from generations and long time. You know, in To the Wonder, we even see these homes being built. You know, these are like newly built homes in the middle of nowhere in Oklahoma, you know. But I see a parallel too in the kind of empty sets and studio lots that we see in Knight of Cups, you know, and the kind of unreality and surreal vacancy that's in a lot of these studio vistas, and how that's replicated in certain American spaces as well. So a lot of amazing things to think about. If anybody, you know, is walking away with anything after this discussion, I think it's that for all of the flaws these films may or may not have, they're rich artifacts of artistry and mastery and poetry, and they're totally worth the time. And so I give a big, you know, shake of the fist to all the naysayers, you know, these are good films, perhaps even great films, and they are films worth taking seriously and working at, and not just dismissing, you know, casually as like, oh, there's Malick doing his thing again, you know?
Right. I wouldn't mind in the distant future coming back and doing a more dedicated discussion of To the Wonder and just like focusing on its themes.
Yeah, I did say after we watched it that there is a part of me that almost wishes that Malick did not make those other two films, because I think that they somehow like steal the thunder from To the Wonder, that they maybe like muddy the waters or dilute just how I think singular and masterful a film To the Wonder really is, you know, and that if it were allowed to just sort of live on its own, perhaps as like the sort of spiritual sequel to Tree of Life, then maybe we would have a different perspective on it. But I think because it was followed up by these other two films that, again, in my opinion, are somewhat less successful, that it just doesn't quite get to enjoy the status that I think it really ought to have.
I think it's fruitful to think about the films. This is kind of what's come up for me since rewatching them in the last week. I've been thinking a lot these days about kind of the desire for greatness that is in, you know, the heart, I think we could say, of any artist, but especially if you're interested in film, like it's, you know, one of those desires you're contending to answer. You know, Joseph Pieper, I was reading one of his short books called, I think it's called like A Treatise on Virtues of the Human Heart. And he talks about magnificence as a virtue, the desire to make great things, essentially. And if you actually, go on and study like what St. Thomas says about it, he talks particularly about paying honor to like, the most important things. And this is kind of reframed how I see like, I was criticizing earlier those critics who would turn down the Weightless Trilogy over the Tree of Life because they're kind of like just not great enough or whatever. And I think there's some truth to that, in that the Tree of Life is such a obviously great work. Like, it's hard to articulate, but it's like just so obviously great. But I think because it's dealing with the greatest things, like, and it's and kind of on every level, like natural, time, space, like everything. It's just like it's so consumed with everything. And these films, by contrast, seem very small. And I think, as the critical conversation around them develops, I think I hope we kind of find more of a place for these kinds of films, not even in the lexicon of like A side, B side, like, oh, it's like these are just the lesser kind of good works. But I think we have to admit, like, they are not great in the same way. They're not concerned with the greatest things. And yet there is a kind of more humble greatness that they kind of find their way into through the personal and through the, I don't know. Does this make sense?
Maybe there's more room for experimentation in these things where like they're not as concerned with the same level of thematic grandeur. I don't know.
Maybe, yeah. But I think, there's also, I think you could describe varying degrees of perfection, and so even if the scale is more focused or sort of personal, that there's still like a great deal of perfection, perhaps. I would say, especially into the wonder that that
for what it is.
But when we first took on this project of working through Malick's filmography, for me, it was all with a view toward arriving here and talking about these movies. Again, because they were my entry point into Malick, but also because I think that they're, for me, the most exciting films of Malick's. They're the ones that I want to talk about the most. And so I'm glad that we finally got here. We're not done yet.
Yeah.
We still have Hidden Life, and hopefully, not too long after that, we'll be able to talk about
The Way of the Wind.
The Way of the Wind is at least the working title. Who knows
Sinless.
what it'll be when it's
Sinless.
Yeah. So thank you guys for talking about these movies with.
Yeah. Thanks.
Thank you guys.
Good stuff. Yeah. Great.
And thank you, listener, for joining us for this. Hopefully, if you haven't seen these films, you're newly inspired to consider doing so. Consider thoughtfully and responsibly, with full view to the good of your soul. But we're also happy to hear what your thoughts are. Again, like I said, a lot of this is still a very open question for me. And I think that this is a great dialogue that we could be having, especially with other filmmakers. Not that I'm a filmmaker myself, but I am an artist. About how to thread the needle on some of these things. And keep exploring new vistas. But in the meantime, if you want to support this work, head over to catholicculture.org. We've got a lot of other stuff going on. You can join our mailing list, and we've got a big fundraising campaign going on. And so if you're part of the handful of people who are listening to a 2-hour discussion of Malick's Weightless Trilogy, then I think, you really owe it to yourself to pay for the things that you like, to support the things that you appreciate, and toss us a few bones. We could really use the help. And with all of that, thank you, listeners. Have a good rest of your life, and goodbye.
All right.
Criteria is a production of CatholicCulture.org. Check out our other podcasts, including Way of the Fathers, an early church history podcast hosted by Jim Papandrea, Catholic Culture audiobooks bringing to life classic Catholic writings, and the Catholic Culture Podcast, an interview show exploring Catholic arts, culture, and issues. You'll find all of this, as well as Catholic news, commentary, liturgical resources, and much more at CatholicCulture.org.